In a suffocating prison visiting room, beneath harsh yellow light bleeding through barred windows, a man in a blue jumpsuit sat motionless, his tattooed arms resting on his knees, his breathing controlled, counting the final hours of his life. Tomorrow morning was his execution. But before the state took his life, he made one final request. A request that sent shockwaves through every officer who heard it. He didn't ask for a priest. He didn't ask for his family. He didn't ask for clemency. He asked to see his dog one last time. The only living being who had never betrayed him. His retired police dog Koda. The guards thought it was unusual, even sentimental. The officials expected a tearful goodbye. But when the German shepherd entered that room, everything shattered. Instead of reunion, Koda began growling viciously, not at his former partner but at the officers watching from the walls. The room froze in stunned silence. No one understood what was about to be exposed. Minutes later, a truth detonated, one that tore apart an entire department's corruption. Stay with us because this story will leave you breathless. Before we begin, make sure to hit like and subscribe. And honestly, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. The prison stirred before sunrise, long before the first rays of light touched the coiled razor wire crowning the perimeter walls. A cold, oppressive silence gripped the corridors, the kind that only descended on execution mornings. Even the guards, men and women hardened by years of lockdowns and violence, carried themselves differently today. Their boots struck the polished concrete floor with a rhythm that sounded less like walking and more like a death march. At the end of the maximum security wing sat a man whose name had once been spoken with respect across police departments nationwide. His name was Caelum Vance, former K-9 officer, former elite handler, former decorated hero. Now he was nothing more than inmate 47829 in a blue prison uniform, waiting for the final summons to the chamber. But Caelum wasn't pacing his cell. He wasn't weeping. He wasn't begging the guards for a miracle. He sat perfectly still on the edge of his steel bunk, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles had gone white, as if praying without uttering a single word. The black tattoos covering both forearms seemed to tell stories his mouth could no longer speak. The guards observing him through the reinforced glass exchanged troubled glances. "Never seen one this calm," one muttered, shifting his weight uncomfortably. "Yeah," the other whispered back, arms crossed. "Makes it worse somehow. Like he knows something we don't." Caelum heard every syllable, but he didn't flinch. His mind was miles away from these walls. Back to a time before the steel bars, before the shackles, before the trial that destroyed his reputation and stole his freedom. A time when he still wore a badge with pride. A time when a German shepherd named Koda was always 3 steps behind him. His partner, his guardian, his family. A sharp electronic buzz cut through the hallway as the main security door unlocked with a metallic clang. Every guard straightened reflexively. The warden stepped through, a clipboard pressed against his chest, his expression professionally neutral. Behind him walked the prison chaplain and a psychologist with her hands folded. The standard delegation. The final confirmation. The final walk. "Caelum Vance," the warden announced, his voice firm but carrying an unexpected thread of humanity. "You will be escorted to the chamber in approximately 2 hours. If you have any final requests beyond the one already granted, now is the time to make them known." Caelum lifted his head slowly. His eyes, exhausted, shadowed but strangely serene, locked onto the warden's. "No," he answered, his voice steady as stone. "Just the one." The warden gave a single nod. He already knew the request. Everyone in the facility did. It had been the subject of whispered conversations and skeptical looks for the past week. Some called it touching. Others called it pathetic. None of them understood what was about to happen. None of them knew that in less than 2 hours, a German shepherd would walk into that visiting room and tear down a conspiracy built on lies, murder, and corrupted badges. Caelum Vance wasn't always a condemned man. There was a time when his name commanded respect in every precinct from the city center to the outermost districts. A time when rookies studied his arrest records like sacred texts, when seasoned detectives nodded in acknowledgement when he walked past, when the media called him the canine handler who never missed. For 7 years, Caelum and Koda were unstoppable. They tracked fleeing suspects through miles of urban wilderness, located missing children buried under rubble after building collapses, sniffed out narcotics shipments worth millions hidden in false compartments that human eyes would never detect. Their success rate wasn't just impressive, it was legendary. 83 high-risk arrests, 47 commendations, 0 officer casualties on any operation they led. The department brass loved parading them at press conferences, the living embodiment of precision and loyalty working in perfect harmony. But legends are fragile things. They shatter the moment doubt creeps in. It happened on a rain-soaked Thursday night 14 months ago. A warehouse raid in the industrial district targeting what intelligence suggested was a major drug distribution hub. Caelum and Koda were assigned point position, standard protocol given their track record. What should have been a textbook operation turned into a bloodbath. When backup breached the building, they found Caelum unconscious on the concrete floor, covered in blood. Koda stood over him, teeth bared, refusing to let anyone approach. And 3 feet away lay Lieutenant Commander Richard Hollis, a decorated 30-year veteran, dead from a single gunshot wound to the chest. Caelum's service weapon had been fired. Gunpowder residue coated his hands. The ballistics matched perfectly. The surveillance footage from outside the warehouse showed only Caelum and the lieutenant entering, no one else. When Caelum finally regained consciousness in the hospital 2 days later, he claimed he couldn't remember what happened. Convenient amnesia, the prosecutors called it. The trauma of murdering a superior officer. The department's internal investigation moved with brutal efficiency. They discovered encrypted files on Caelum's personal laptop detailing Lieutenant Hollis's suspicions about a K-9 unit officer running interference for criminal operations. Bank deposits into offshore accounts under variations of Caelum's name. Witness testimony from 3 officers who claimed they'd seen Caelum meeting with known cartel associates. The evidence wasn't just damning, it was airtight, mathematically precise, absolutely inescapable. The trial lasted 11 days. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Guilty of first-degree murder. Guilty of corruption. Guilty of betraying every oath he'd ever sworn. The judge showed no mercy. Death by lethal injection. Koda was immediately retired from active duty and reassigned to a young officer named Caelum, who'd been Caelum's protege. The department wanted to erase every trace of their fallen hero, to pretend the legend had never existed at all. But Caelum never stopped claiming his innocence. Even as they locked him in maximum security. Even as appeal after appeal was systematically denied. Even as the execution date was set and the final hours began their countdown. He maintained the same story. Someone set him up, someone wanted Hollis dead, and someone was still out there wearing a badge while an innocent man prepared to die. No one believed him. Until today, no one had any reason to. Caelum met Koda on the worst day of both their lives. It was 6 years before the warehouse, before the accusations, before everything turned to ash. Caelum was a rookie K-9 handler fresh out of the academy, still learning to read canine body language, still making mistakes that more experienced handlers would never forgive. Koda was a 3-year-old German Shepherd with a violent history, a rescue from an illegal fighting operation, scarred across his muzzle, aggressive toward handlers, already scheduled for euthanasia after attacking 2 trainers who tried to work with him. The department had written Koda off as untrainable, too damaged, too dangerous. But Caelum saw something different in those amber eyes during their first meeting in the kennels. Not rage. Fear. A dog who'd learned that humans only brought pain, who'd never known what trust felt like. "Give me 2 weeks," Caelum had told the supervising sergeant. "If I can't reach him, I'll sign the paperwork myself." Those 2 weeks changed everything. Caelum didn't use force. Didn't use dominance tactics. He simply sat outside Koda's kennel for hours, talking softly, offering food from his own hand, showing the broken animal that not all humans were monsters. On day 9, Koda took a piece of dried meat from Caelum's palm without biting. On day 12, he allowed Caelum to touch his scarred head. On day 14, when Caelum opened the kennel door and walked away, Koda followed. They became inseparable. Where Caelum walked, Koda shadowed. Where Koda alerted, Caelum investigated. They developed a communication that transcended commands. A glance, a subtle shift in posture, a nearly imperceptible change in breathing pattern. Other handlers needed verbal cues and hand signals. Caelum and Koda operated on instinct and absolute trust. Their bond was forged into steel during a hostage crisis in a residential neighborhood. An armed suspect had barricaded himself inside a home with his ex-wife and 2 children. SWAT was preparing for breach when Koda suddenly broke from Caelum's side and circled to the building's rear. Every protocol said to recall him immediately. But Caelum trusted his partner's instincts. He followed. Koda had detected what the thermal imaging missed: a basement window left partially open, a weakness in the suspect's fortress. Caelum and Koda entered silently, navigating the darkness by feel and scent. When they found the suspect with a gun pressed to his hostage's head, Koda didn't wait for commands. He launched himself at the armed man with surgical precision, disarming him in seconds while Caelum secured the weapon. 3 lives saved. 0 shots fired. The kind of perfect execution that only comes from 2 souls operating as one. After that night, their legend began to grow. They became the team every department requested for impossible situations. The handler who trusted his dog more than technology. The dog who'd die before letting his human fall. That bond, forged in mutual salvation and tempered through countless operations, was supposed to be unbreakable. Even death row couldn't sever it. Even 14 months of separation couldn't erase what they'd built together. Caelum knew that if anyone could see the truth the courts had missed, it would be Koda. Because dogs don't lie. Dogs remember. And dogs never forget the scent of their partner's attackers. The intelligence briefing had been straightforward. Anonymous tip. High-volume narcotics distribution operating out of Warehouse 17 in the Industrial District. Standard raid protocol. Lieutenant Commander Richard Hollis would lead. Caelum and Koda would take point for initial sweep. Backup units staged 2 blocks out. Simple, clean, by the book. Except nothing about that night was by the book. Caelum remembered the rain hammering against his patrol vehicle as he and Koda approached the warehouse perimeter. He remembered Hollis's voice crackling through the radio, unusually tense, instructing Caelum to hold position while he entered first to assess. He remembered ignoring that order when Koda's ears suddenly flattened, when that low growl rumbled from his partner's chest, the warning signal that something was catastrophically wrong. They entered through the south loading dock, Koda's nose working overtime, body language screaming danger. The warehouse interior was darker than it should have been, emergency lighting disabled, shadows pooling in corners like oil. Caelum's flashlight beam cut through the blackness, sweeping across empty crates, abandoned pallets, and then voices. Hollis's voice, sharp and accusatory. And another voice Caelum recognized. Lieutenant Silas Thorne from Internal Affairs. "You shouldn't have come looking, Richard," Thorne was saying, his tone cold as January frost. "Some doors are meant to stay closed." Caelum froze, pressing against a steel support column, hand instinctively moving to Koda's collar to keep him silent. Through a gap in the stacked containers, he could see them, Hollis with his service weapon drawn but lowered, Thorne flanked by 2 other figures. One of them was Jackson Vane, a junior officer from Patrol Division, his face pale and sweating even in the warehouse chill. "Evidence laundering, Silas?" Hollis's voice shook with barely contained rage. "You're running a goddamn criminal protection racket through the evidence room. How long? How many cases have you buried?" "Long enough that you'll never prove it," Thorne replied. "And smart enough to know when loose ends need cutting." The gunshot exploded through the warehouse like thunder. Hollis dropped, clutching his chest, blood spreading across his shirt in a dark bloom. Caelum's breath caught. He should have moved, should have called for backup, should have done something. But shock paralyzed him for 3 fatal seconds. Koda's growl gave them away. Thorne's head snapped toward their position. "We've got company. Handle it." Jackson Vane materialized from the shadows like a ghost, his face twisted in terror and determination. Caelum saw the blade too late, a tactical knife that punched through his ribs with white-hot agony, stealing his breath, buckling his knees. He heard Koda's savage snarl, felt his partner launching toward the attacker, and then everything fragmented into chaos and pain. Someone struck Koda with something heavy. The dog's yelp of pain cut through Caelum's consciousness like broken glass. Hands dragged him across the concrete floor, pressed his fingers around cold metal, his own service weapon. A gunshot. Hollis's body nearby. Koda barking frantically, then silence as someone muzzled him, dragged him away. Caelum's last conscious thought before darkness swallowed him was the image of Thorn's face hovering above him, lips moving in words he couldn't hear, arranging the crime scene with professional precision. When Caelum woke 2 days later in a hospital bed with armed guards at his door, the narrative had already been written, the evidence planted, the witnesses coached. And Koda, his only witness to the truth, had been stripped of his badge and locked away where his testimony would never matter. The visiting room door opened with a metallic groan that seemed to hang in the air longer than it should. Caelum's heart, which had maintained its steady rhythm through 14 months of hell, suddenly hammered against his ribs. Every muscle in his body tensed as footsteps echoed in the corridor beyond. Then Koda appeared. Officer Caelum held the leash loosely, barely maintaining contact as the German shepherd entered the room. The dog looked older, gray had touched the fur around his muzzle, and there was a slight stiffness in his gait that hadn't been there before. But his eyes, those sharp amber eyes, were exactly as Caelum remembered. 15 minutes, the warden announced from his position near the door. Physical contact is permitted. Any signs of aggression and we terminate immediately. Caelum barely heard him. His entire world had narrowed to the animal standing 10 feet away. He wanted to call out, to speak Koda's name, to bridge the impossible distance between them. But his throat had closed completely, choked with emotions he'd buried for over a year. Caelum unclipped the leash, stepping back to give them space. "Go ahead, boy," he said softly, his voice carrying genuine affection. "Go see him." This was the moment everyone expected. The heartwarming reunion. The loyal dog rushing to his condemned handler. The tearful goodbye that would leave observers reaching for tissues. The guards standing against the walls, 5 of them, an unusually heavy presence, shifted their weight in anticipation of the emotional scene about to unfold. But Koda didn't move forward. Instead, the dog's entire demeanor transformed in an instant. His ears snapped forward, rotating like radar dishes. His body lowered into a stance Caelum recognized immediately, the investigative posture Koda adopted when entering potentially hostile environments. The dog's nostrils flared, processing the room's scent profile with an intensity that made his whole body quiver. Caelum's breath caught. This wasn't greeting behavior. This was working mode. Koda wasn't seeing his former partner. He was analyzing a crime scene. "What's he doing?" one of the guards muttered, hand instinctively moving toward his radio. Caelum frowned, clearly confused. He's never acted like this before." "Koda, what's wrong?" The German shepherd's head swiveled slowly, methodically scanning every corner of the room. His gaze swept past the warden, past Caelum, past the simple wooden chair where Caelum sat frozen. But when Koda's eyes reached the 5 officers lined against the far wall, something changed. The dog's muscles coiled. A low rumble built in his chest, not quite a growl yet, but close. His focus had locked onto someone in that line of uniformed bodies. His tail had gone rigid, pointing like a compass needle toward danger. Caelum followed his partner's gaze and felt his blood turn to ice. Among the 5 officers stood Lieutenant Silas Thorn, his face an unreadable mask of professional neutrality. And beside him, visibly trembling despite his attempt to stand at attention, was Jackson Vane. Both men were supposed to be witnesses to Caelum's final request. Standard protocol for high-profile executions. Except Koda wasn't treating them like witnesses. He was treating them like threats. The dog's lip curled back, exposing teeth that had once saved Caelum's life a dozen times. That low rumble escalated into something more dangerous, more certain. Koda had found something. And whatever it was standing less than 15 feet away wearing a badge and a gun. Koda finally moved, but not the way anyone expected. There was no joyful sprint across the polished floor, No tail wagging, no excited whining of recognition. Instead, the German Shepherd approached Caelum with deliberate, measured steps. The same careful advance he'd used when clearing buildings for explosives or tracking wounded suspects through dense terrain. "Koda," Caelum whispered, his voice breaking on the single syllable. He extended his tattooed hand, fingers trembling slightly, hoping for even the smallest acknowledgement of their bond. The dog came close enough that Caelum could feel the heat radiating from his fur, close enough to smell the familiar scent of the kennel shampoo Caelum must still use. But Koda didn't nuzzle into Caelum's palm. Didn't press his head against Caelum's leg seeking affection. Instead, his attention fixed on something else entirely. Koda's nose dropped to Caelum's left side, just below his ribs. The dog began pawing at the blue fabric of the prison jumpsuit with increasing urgency, his claws scratching against the material. A high-pitched whine escaped his throat, not the whine of a pet seeking attention, but the specific alert signal he'd been trained to give when detecting evidence at crime scenes. "What's he doing?" the warden asked, stepping forward slightly. "Is he trying to play?" "That's not play," Caelum said quietly, his trained eyes recognizing the behavior. "That's an evidence alert. He's found something." Caelum looked down at where Koda was pawing. The exact spot where Jackson Vane's blade had entered his body 14 months ago. The wound had healed months back, leaving only a raised scar beneath the fabric. Nothing visible. Nothing anyone else could detect. But Koda knew. Dogs never forgot scent markers associated with trauma, with injury, with their partner's blood. The physical sensation of Koda's paw pressing against the old wound sent a shockwave through Caelum's nervous system. The scar tissue suddenly felt hot, electric, alive with phantom pain. And with that pain came something else. Something his mind had locked away in the deepest vault of his psyche for over a year. The warehouse. The darkness. The voices. Lieutenant Hollis falling, blood spreading across his chest like spilled wine. Movement from the shadows. A figure emerging, face pale and drenched with sweat despite the cold. Jackson Vane. Young, terrified, holding a tactical knife in a white-knuckled grip. "I'm sorry," Vane had whispered, the words barely audible over Koda's barking. "I'm so sorry." He said, "It's the only way." He said, "Do it now." Lieutenant Thorne's voice, sharp as broken glass, cutting through Vane's hesitation. "Make it clean. We frame him or we're all dead." The blade punching through flesh. The white-hot agony stealing his breath. Koda's savage snarl as he launched himself at the attacker. Something heavy striking the dog mid-leap. Hands dragging Caelum across concrete, arranging his body, pressing his fingers around his own service weapon, pulling the trigger while his consciousness flickered like a dying bulb. "No," Caelum gasped, the memory slamming into him with the force of a freight train. His hands shot to his left side, fingers finding the scar through the fabric. "No, I remember. I remember everything." Every head in the room turned toward him. But Caelum's eyes had locked onto one face in the line of officers against the wall. Jackson Vane stood frozen, his skin the color of old newspaper, sweat beading on his forehead despite the room's chill. His hands trembled visibly at his sides. And beside him, Lieutenant Silas Thorne's jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly, his eyes narrowing with the cold calculation of a man watching his carefully constructed lie begin to crumble. Koda's head snapped up from Caelum's side with the suddenness of a gunshot. The whining stopped. The pawing ceased. Every muscle in the German Shepherd's body went rigid as steel cable pulled taut. His attention had shifted entirely away from his former handler, drawn toward something, or someone, across the room. The transformation was instantaneous and absolute. This was no longer a retired police dog seeking comfort with a familiar face. This was a tactical weapon identifying hostile targets. The hackles along Koda's spine rose in a pronounced ridge, making him appear larger, more formidable. His ears pinned back flat against his skull. His lips peeled away from his teeth in a display that had nothing to do with aggression training and everything to do with primal recognition of danger. And from deep in his chest came a growl so low and sustained it seemed to vibrate through the floor itself. Officer Caelan's hand instinctively moved to his hip, though his weapon had been secured outside the visiting room per protocol. "Koda, heel," he commanded, his voice firm but confused. The dog had never disobeyed him in 14 months of partnership. Koda didn't move. Didn't even acknowledge the command. His entire focus had locked onto the line of 5 officers standing against the far wall like a firing squad. But he wasn't looking at all of them. His attention had narrowed to 2 specific targets. Lieutenant Silas Thorne stood with military precision, hands clasped behind his back, face carved from stone. But there was something in his eyes now, a flicker of calculation, of rapid assessment, like a chess player suddenly realizing his opponent had seen through his strategy. Beside him, Jackson Vane was coming apart. The younger officer's hands trembled so violently he'd stuffed them into his pockets to hide the shaking. Sweat darkened the collar of his uniform. His breathing had become shallow, rapid, audible even across the room. And his eyes, wide with barely contained panic, kept darting between the growling dog and the exit. "What the hell is wrong with that animal?" one of the other officers muttered, taking a cautious step backward. But Caelum understood. He'd worked with Koda long enough to read the subtle variations in his alerts. This wasn't territorial aggression. This wasn't fear-based reactivity. This was the same focused intensity Koda displayed when tracking a fleeing suspect, when he'd locked onto a scent trail and wouldn't relent until he'd found his target. "He's identifying someone," Caelum said slowly, his training overriding his confusion. "This is a threat response. He's telling us there's danger in this room." The warden moved forward. "Officer Caelum, you need to control your—" "Wait," Caelum interrupted, his voice stronger now, carrying the authority of a man who'd spent 7 years reading this dog's every signal. He pushed himself to his feet, the chair scraping against the floor. "Let him work. Koda's never wrong. He's found something." Koda took 3 deliberate steps toward the line of officers, his growl intensifying with each movement. His focus never wavered from Thorne and Vane. The scent memory was absolute. These were the men. These were the scents burned into his olfactory memory from that warehouse night. The scent of Caelum's blood on their hands. The scent of gunpowder and fear and conspiracy. Jackson Vane's nerve finally broke. "Get that dog away from me," he stammered, backing against the wall, hands raised defensively. "Get him away." Thorne's hand moved subtly toward his sidearm. "This is ridiculous. The animal's clearly unstable, just like his former handler." But Koda knew. And now, watching Vane's breakdown and Thorne's calculated threat, everyone else in that room was beginning to understand. Dogs don't lie. Scent memory doesn't fade. And after 14 months of separation, Koda had just identified his partner's attackers standing less than 10 feet away. Lieutenant Silas Thorne's voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk, smooth and authoritative. "This is a waste of everyone's time. The animal is displaying residual training aggression, nothing more. Officer Caelum, remove the dog from this room immediately." "That's an order." He stepped forward with the confidence of a man accustomed to being obeyed, his hand resting casually on his duty belt. The other officers began to shift, preparing to assist if needed. The warden nodded, ready to end what had become an uncomfortable spectacle. But Koda didn't retreat. If anything, the dog advanced another step, his growl deepening into something almost feral. His eyes, those intelligent amber eyes, remained locked on Thorne with an intensity that transcended animal instinct. This was recognition. This was memory. This was accusation. "I said remove him," Thorne repeated, his tone hardening. "Now. Stop." The word came out as barely a whisper, but it froze every person in the room. Jackson Vane stood pressed against the wall, his face drained of all color, his entire body trembling like a man standing on the edge of a cliff. His eyes were fixed not on Thorne, not on the warden or the other officers, but on Koda. On the dog whose unwavering focus had become a mirror reflecting 14 months of buried guilt. "Officer Vane?" The warden's voice carried a note of concern. "Are you all right?" "He knows." Vane's voice cracked on the words. "God help me, the dog knows." Thorne's expression never changed, but something flickered behind his eyes. A calculation, a threat. "Jackson, you're clearly experiencing some kind of episode. We should get you medical attention." I can't do this anymore. Vane's shout echoed off the walls, raw and desperate. His hands came up to his face, fingers digging into his temples. I can't sleep. I haven't slept in 14 months. Every time I close my eyes, I see him bleeding on that warehouse floor. I see that dog trying to protect him while we... Officer Vane, you need to stop talking right now. Thorne's voice had gone cold as January ice, each word a barely veiled threat. That's an order. But the dam had broken. 14 months of psychological torture, of carrying the weight of an innocent man's death sentence, of watching Caelum Vance count down to execution for a crime Vane himself had committed, it all came flooding out in a torrent of confession. It was us, Vane sobbed, sliding down the wall to his knees. Lieutenant Thorne was running protection for the Martinez cartel through the evidence room. Hollis found out. He was going to expose everything. Thorne ordered me to. He made me. His voice broke completely. I stabbed him. I stabbed Caelum Vance in that warehouse while Lieutenant Hollis was bleeding out on the floor. We planted the gun in his hand. We shot Hollis with Caelum's weapon while he was unconscious. We fabricated the bank records, the encrypted files, the witness statements. All of it. The room had gone deathly silent. Every officer stood frozen in shock. The warden's face had turned ashen. Caelan's hand had moved to his radio, fingers hovering over the emergency call button. Thorne's mask finally cracked. His hand moved toward his sidearm with predatory speed. You stupid weak. But Koda was faster. The German shepherd launched himself across the space between them, 80 pounds of trained muscle and protective fury. He hit Thorne's arm just as the weapon cleared its holster, jaws clamping down with precision that came from 7 years of tactical training. The gun clattered to the floor. 3 officers swarmed Thorne immediately, driving him to the ground, securing his arms behind his back while he screamed threats and curses. Another officer grabbed the fallen weapon. And Caelum Vance, the man condemned to die in less than an hour, stood in the center of the chaos with tears streaming down his face while his partner, his brother, stood guard between him and the men who tried to destroy them both. The warden's hand slammed down on the red emergency button mounted on the wall. Alarms shrieked through the facility. Within seconds, the visiting room flooded with correctional officers and supervising personnel. Lieutenant Silas Thorne was dragged from the room in handcuffs, still screaming about lawsuits and jurisdiction and career suicide for anyone who touched him. Jackson Vane went quietly, his confession continuing in broken sobs as they led him away. The execution was suspended immediately. An emergency call went to the state attorney general's office before Thorne had even cleared the prison gates. By nightfall, federal investigators had descended on the facility, recording Vane's full testimony, securing evidence, dismantling the carefully constructed lie that had sent an innocent man to death row. Caelum spent that night, the night he was supposed to die, in a private holding cell with Koda curled at his feet, refusing to leave his partner's side. Officer Caelum had waived every protocol in the book to allow it. No one had the heart to separate them again. The legal proceedings moved with unprecedented speed. Vane's confession triggered a complete review of the original case. Forensic analysts discovered the planted evidence within days, digital timestamps that didn't align, bank records with metadata proving they'd been created after Caelum's arrest, witness statements that contradicted security footage the original investigators had conveniently overlooked. Lieutenant Thorne's criminal enterprise unraveled thread by thread, exposing a corruption network that had operated for nearly a decade. 12 additional officers were implicated. 43 criminal cases were reopened for review. 3 weeks after Koda walked into that visiting room, the state formally vacated Caelum Vance's conviction. All charges dismissed. Full exoneration. The governor issued a public apology. The department offered a settlement that Caelum's lawyers called inadequate but accepted anyway because freedom was worth more than money. And on a clear morning in early spring, Caelum Vance walked through the front gates of the prison he'd been condemned to die in. He wore civilian clothes for the first time in 14 months. Jeans, a simple gray shirt, boots that felt strange after years of prison-issue shoes. The morning sun felt impossibly bright on his face. The air tasted different outside those walls, sweeter somehow, carrying the scent of freedom he'd forgotten existed. Officer Caelum waited just beyond the gate, Koda sitting perfectly at his side in dress uniform, a final tribute to the dog who'd saved his former handler's life. When Caelum approached, Caelum stood and extended the leash with both hands, a formal gesture that carried the weight of ceremony. "He's been waiting for this," Caelum said, his voice thick with emotion. "We both have." Caelum took the leash, his tattooed fingers wrapping around the leather he'd held 1,000 times before. The moment his hand made contact, Koda's professional composure shattered. The German shepherd surged forward, front paws hitting Caelum's chest, tongue lapping at his bearded face in joyous abandon. 14 months of separation, of forced distance, of unspoken loyalty, all of it poured out in that reunion. Caelum sank to his knees on the pavement,